Welcome to the Acquivore podcast. My name is Don Mansfield. I'll be your host. I'm here along with Nick Sanders and Jennifer Townsend. Um, I own the business Don Acquisition LLC. I provide acquisition training in a number of contracting topics. My two main courses are the SAP course, Simplified Acquisition Procedures course, and the DFARS course. And soon I'll be putting a list of webinars up on my site that'll be available for people to have a short training session for their organizations. Let's see, let's go to Jennifer.
My name is Jennifer Townsend. I am the owner of Contracting Courses, so cleverly named because we teach contracting courses. And right now, the two main courses that we teach or that I teach, it's basically just me, but is on the FAR contract clauses, and then the second one is on government commercial contracts, which focuses on the difference between a holistic difference between the commercial, like buying commercial under the Uniform Commercial Code or commercial services, and then how the government buys commercial, which is very different. I should say very different, but substantially different. So those are
Nick
my two
Sanders
courses.
here. I am the owner
All
and
right,
principal
Nick.
consultant at Apogee Consulting, EIZ. And it's hard to say what I do. I wish I had a very concise speech like Jennifer and Don. I do a lot of things and have for over a decade. Most recently, we're helping a business that's new to DoD contracting figure out how to make a commercial assertion and then comply with the commercial clauses that'll be in their contract from DoD. And I've also helped a large ordnance manufacturer with a very tricky termination for convenience situation. So, kind of just do whatever needs to be done in the administrative background. And I also, as Don's showing, I also do a blog, and I've done that blog for a very long time. Now looking at more than 1 million words. Hopefully some of them are useful, but I can't guarantee it. But that's kind of what I do. And Don, with your permission, I'll get tonight's topic started. So tonight is really
Sure.
it's hard to even come at this. This has tentacles, like all the good stories should have. The immediate issue is DoD Inspector General, DoDIG, recently issued an audit report that was critical of contracting officers for not adequately dispositioning DCAA audit findings in the way they should. That was the immediate thing. So I'm always interested in that, and I was looking at it, and why didn't the contracting officers do what they should have done? And because they didn't do what they should have done, perhaps as much as $98 million of questioned DCA cost was allowed to be billed through by the contractors because the contracting officer didn't actually adjudicate and disposition each finding the way they should. That was the issue. But I started to think about it, and this thing just has tentacles. So why don't the DoD contracting officers follow their own guidance? And then I started thinking about, well, why is there so much guidance for them to follow? Why is it that everything is so prescriptive for a DoD contracting officer? It's like they just don't have the discretion. And it reminded me of an article that was written 5 years ago by a lawyer called the shrinking role of the contracting officer. And it was basically, looking back at 1955 and 1960, contracting officers were pretty important people. They made a lot of important decisions, and they had a lot of discretion that went along with their certificate of appointment. Nowadays, it seems like, according to the instructions that DCMA puts out, they're not allowed to do much of anything unless they check with legal and follow the instructions to the letter and document everything. And of course, that takes time, and we wonder why everything slowed down. And then I started thinking about the history of DCMA that I documented in my blog, actually, how 10 years ago, DCMA acknowledged that during the late 90s and early 2000s, they had a dramatic loss of workforce, which led to a loss of skill set. And they didn't really have any way of getting the skill set back except to centralize everything, to create little centers of expertise and then promulgate centralized command and control and require the contracting officers to follow and do what they were told. So we have to talk about that tonight as well. I'm sure Jennifer and Don have stories to tell about that. So this is just one of those topics that just keeps going and going. It starts with contracting officers not following the instruction, but it really gets into why should they? Why should they follow these instructions? What happened to contracting officer discretion? So having set it up, I turn it over to whoever wants to speak next.
Jennifer.
Well, I could also go on and on about this, I think, because because Nick in his blog article points out that there's been this I don't know what word to use, but change in instruction or guidance as far as certification and training. And even after I'd been in the workforce, somewhere between 5 and 10 years, I think there was a great deal of discussion about the bathtub effect and, the loss of the skill set and some very interesting and pertinent discussions on WIFCON about the lack of training and skill set in the acquisition workforce. And it is fascinating. I think there was this time period, I'm pretty sure I read that article about the shrinking role of the contracting officer or something very similar to it, because, up to the professionalization of the acquisition workforce, there was, I think, this big I hate to say it this way, but arguably contracting officers were more professional in the sense that they spent, quite a bit of time, gaining independent thought and discretion and judgment and experience. And it took, some period of time to get where they were. But then there was this thought process of, we need to professionalize the acquisition workforce. And what came along with that professionalization was, when you think of professional jobs, you think of doctor, lawyer, accountants, engineers, people that have to have a college degree, that have to take, fairly elaborate exam and pass it. And many people fail those exams and they have to take the exam several times. And in some cases, some people never pass those exams. And then they have the continuing education. And so when DoD professionalized the acquisition workforce, they required a college degree. They set up a certification series and professional training. What I don't think what they never did have a professional exam. And I think some of that was related to, I had this discussion with an attorney at DAU, Larry, Don knows him. I can't think of his last name. Fedak, I think was his last name. Yeah. And he said, well, that's because DOD has no idea what they would do with all the people who would fail the exam. And there was some degree of truth to that because, in the civil service, you do have property rights to your job. And that, there was this big, concern about, if we did have people failing, then what would happen to those people? And at the time I even joined DAU in 2000, approximately 2005, DAU had done away with almost all the exams attached to any of their courses. So basically you could just go to a DAU course and sit there for the time period and you would pass. And so there was literally no, and I remember teaching the first few courses and thinking these people aren't even paying attention. And, I knew they were walking out of the course knowing not knowing the material, and it became very frustrating for me, and it was, became a passion while I was at DAU. That was one of the reasons I tried to entice Don to come over, is because I just felt that there needed to be better instruction. But so anyway, there was this lack of training, quality training that was going on, even though at the same time you had this theoretical professionalization going on. And now what I find even more ironic is it's like they're kind of doing away with much of the professionalization stuff. Like the degree is no longer required. There's only one level of certification, but they are putting a test in place. But I still I feel skeptical, highly skeptical, that this test will actually be, of any difficulty, because they still the core problem is still there. What are you going to do with all of the contracting officers who fail? Do they just get to retake it? Does someone sit there next to them and help them pass? It's very unclear. But I would put out there that the training is certainly contributed to it. I have many more thoughts, but I'll let Dawn talk first.
Sure. So one thing I was thinking of when Nick was kind of describing how the role of the contracting officers kind of changed over time, reminds me of somebody once, I guess, kind of did an analysis of the workforce and says, all right, you got professionals, you have administrators, and you have clerks, right? I think that the contracting field at one time probably had professionals. Like in 1102 was a professional, right? They were a supervisor. They had people under them, contract specialists under them. They would have a procurement technician, usually like a clerk. But that kind of structure of the workforce has changed. And I think that contracting work has become more administrative in practice than professional. And I think the people that are like rising in the ranks in the contracting world are administrators. They're not contract professionals, they're administrators. So they're very comfortable dictating everything that needs to be done. And, taking all discretion away from those below. Because that's how they operate. That's how the administrator operates. They just want to follow the rules. They want to, run the algorithm. And they don't want to really think too deeply about things. So I don't know how to solve that, but I do kind of see that there isn't really a lot of critical thought when you get up to the leadership positions in acquisition.
So
Jennifer being the exception.
Having teed it up, I realized I forgot to tee up the training aspect, which is how I started my whole article. But yeah, so here we are today with this acquisition workforce, or AWF, 21st century, whatever acronym they're using these days. Back to basics, that's what it is. BTB for the AWF in the 21st century. I'm not making up those acronyms, the DoD did. So basically, they've given up most pretense of training contracting officers, right? I realize that's my biased viewpoint on it, but that's what I take away. And it's easy to grandfather in to keep your position, right? If you're a DAWIA level 1, 2, or 3, I think you just grandfather in. Don't worry about it. No tests to take. And so we're talking really about making a contracting officer a commodity, in my view, right? We have a group of contracting officers. Maybe they'll conduct evaluations and source selections. Who knows? But if they do so, they'll do so by the centralized command and control instructions they're given. And then in post-award in particular, they'll do exactly what their instructions tell them to do. And so maybe my question is, maybe we don't need to be teaching these people critical thinking skills. Maybe they don't even need to understand what a contract is anymore, right? What is consideration? What is a meeting of the minds? Maybe that is all now irrelevant knowledge in the new paradigm that DCMA is creating for itself. And I've got the two people on this podcast who aren't me are former instructors of DCMA contracting officers. So I don't know how they're reacting to me saying that maybe that kind of level of instruction just isn't needed anymore, because all these people apparently need to do is follow their centralized instructions. And if there's any problem whatsoever, check with legal and do what legal says. Don't be a quasi-judicial, independent, unbiased resolver of disputes. Represent the government and execute your instructions, and all will be well. You will not be criticized. I think that's terrible myself, but it seems to be where we are. And then I would just add one more thing, and I'll turn it over to these two for their reactions to what I'm saying, is how does that comport with what the DoD says it wants to do, which is to make acquisitions better and faster, right? Moving at the speed of relevance, whatever that means. You can't move at the speed of relevance if nobody's thinking. You can't innovate. You can't create new things because no one's thinking anymore. They're following the instructions that were created based on the way we did it last year. That way is the death of innovation. So those are my thoughts and comments. I don't know what you think, Jennifer.
I would definitely say that you're there's a lot of truth to what you're saying. I mean, if you do away with that innovation, then then you certainly have got this situation where you aren't going to pay these people as much. And I think that's why, to some degree, that's there's some amount of this. I guess the current plan is a little bit on hold right now because I guess Don can speak to what he heard, but you know, some people in the 1102 community are a little bit concerned by this, and appropriately so, because if you take away the requirement for a degree and you take away different levels of certification, and then you replace 650 or 700 hours or however many it used to be. I mean, I think even, you know, I think it's been a shrinking number of hours all along, because I think back in the, you know, when I first started, it was something over 1,000 hours of training that was required. And, you know, now we're going to get it all down to just 200 hours, and, you know, 200 hours of training and no college degree. That sounds like a GS7 level salary to me. And it sounds like over reliance on a computer, on clause selection programs, on, you know, well, what does the manual say? Vice, you know, and then legal is the one who makes all the critical thinking and the thought processes that, you know, that are going on there. So I certainly think that that appears to be where we're heading, where at the same time, you know, we abolished, well, there was this move afoot to abolish 1105s in the purchasing community almost entirely a couple of years ago, and it looks like we finally, you know, have done it with this new, you know, situation. But we ended up taking a step back, I would say in DoD in particular, and not just DoD, but the entire federal government, there's this law of unintended consequences. And so, you know, we rushed to roll out PD2, procurement desktop defense, and, you know, clause logic programs and so on. And then we got rid of all these clerks because everybody had computers. And then we ended up with 1102s who were doing a lot of clerical work. And so, you know, the question then was being raised appropriately in WIFCON, you know, blogs of, you know, are we overpaying people to just type yes, no to a computer program? And then I think another unintended consequence with the rollout of, I mean, this was one of the main tenets of this recent NCMA webinar about leadership leading us who knows where. And, you know, the assertion was made that with OASIS and the prevalence of IDIQs, we have a large amount of simply ordering officers out there. And that is largely true. You know, as I rose in the ranks of leadership, I discovered that, I would do a workload analysis of every place I went, and the bulk of the work that was being done was ordering under either GSA schedules or IDIQs or whatever, and there was very, very, very small amount of actual pre-award going on. And I think there is recognition of that at higher levels, but there was, there's kind of this, well, what do we do about it? Now we're in this situation, what do we do about it? And so it appears that their current thought is to just eliminate any kind of higher level training and just hope that the few people who are actually needed to do pre-award, or that sort of level of thought, will get extra training somewhere along the way. Not sure where.
Just to comment on what you said before about whether this is on hold right now. So secondhand, I heard that the unions that some 1102s belong to were not notified of these changes, and they're now being given their 30-day notice. And, we'll see what they come back with. But, it could be like, well, what's your plan when people don't pass the test? The same type of thing that's happened before. So I guess we'll wait and see what happens there. But back to what Nick was asking, like, is all we expect from contracting officers now just to, follow the instructions and not really do any thinking? Some organizations, yeah, that's all they expect of their 1102s is just to, follow the instructions to the letter. And there's discomfort when there aren't instructions to follow. Then there's organizations that they're perfectly comfortable letting people be innovative and letting people think and be creative. And those organizations don't need DAU. They don't need a certification. They get it because they have to check a block. But there are organizations out there like that. The one I think I worked at was with Jennifer, which is now called NIWC Pacific, Naval Information Warfare Center Pacific. I would also put the SMC up in LA Air Force Base. I'd put them in that category. I think Hanscom Air Force Base, the contracting office there, I'd put in that category. But there's students who I've had over the years that at their organizations, they're just like, I don't get anything out of this. I've learned how to do an order, right, in my first year. But all I do is orders. I've never done anything different than orders. I just, there's no growth here. What am I doing? So I guess maybe the one size fits all is unrealistic. To think that this training is enough to say that you're now good enough to go, go forth and do contracting. I guess I just don't agree with that. Another thing I wanted to comment on was Vern Edwards had written at one point how the workload does not match the workforce. So if you look at the workload, like Jennifer was describing, it's mostly ordering. It's mostly purchase orders off of existing contracts. Not a lot of new contracts, right? So that workload would suggest more purchasing agents, less contract specialists. But that's not what we have. We have the exact opposite. We have probably 5 times more contract specialists than purchasing agents. Well, guess who does that workload? We have 1102s doing that workload. So I've had students that never did anything other than purchase card that are 1102s. They're showing up in level 2 classes in DAU, and they're getting graded on their knowledge of learning curves, and they're like, when in the world would I ever use this? So there's kind of a mismatch there. So,
To you, Jennifer.
oh,
Just
let me
something that
Oh,
take you off
okay.
mute. Sorry,
So I
Nick.
want to talk about a couple of things.
Go ahead, Nick.
I know Jennifer wants to say something, so I'll just be quick and
well when I
say
was
and say it all falls apart in pre-award, right? Who's going to do cost price analysis on behalf of the government if no one knows how to do it anymore? Now I'll say over to you.
sorry, I was just going to tell a quick story of because I started to experience this actually my first managerial positions, and then it became almost this systemic issue that I was experiencing repeatedly because there were still 1105s out there, or there were lower paid 1102s who were doing ordering and purchasing. But it doesn't take a rocket scientist when you're an 1105 to look around and be like, well, I'm doing exactly what these 1102s are doing, and they're getting twice as much money as I am. And so I would be approached on a somewhat regular basis by 1105s in the office, and they would make this case for how they should be getting paid what 1102s are getting paid. Unfortunately, they weren't following their thought process through, and I would have to explain to them, well, the end outcome of this is, the 1102s, if we ask for a desk audit, are going to get downgraded to 1105 positions, and then your coworker. So the end outcome is all the 1105s aren't going to suddenly be making GS 12 or 13 level salary. It's like all the 1102s who are making 12 and 13 level salary are going to be downgraded to 7 or 9 level salary, and they're going to blame you for it. So it's not going to be a happy experience for anyone. And it was very problematic, and it still is, and this is not a solution. When I was working in the fourth estate, about 2015, the genesis of, I think, this situation was being discussed, and unfortunately I was not able to make the meeting, but I had my policy person go and report back because I was so interested in what they would discuss, because training is a passion of mine. And they would discuss about how, I think in one of the earlier first meetings that has resulted in this beauty, they were discussing about how people were getting DWIA certified without having the 5 years of experience. And so, you were supposed to, in order to get DWIA level 3 certified, you had to have 5 years of experience. And so the working group that was discussing this all decided, well, okay, our solution to that is then we'll require 6 years of experience, which I just thought was quite funny, because you have a situation where you've got people who are falsely certifying people. So you had either supervise, I mean, because they're in the DoD certification system, the person nominates as being certification ready in the system, and they say, well, I'm ready to be DWIA level 2 or DWIA level 3 certified, and the system automatically checks to see if they have their courses, and in theory it should be automatically checking to see if they have the years of experience. But there is some amount of discretion that is involved in that, because those years of experience could be had outside of DoD as a contractor. So for instance, if Nick decided he wanted to come work for the government, his years working in the contractor community could count as prior 1102 experience towards that 5-year certification. But that's where this independent thought and judgment comes into play, is well, what did this person do, how did they do it, what kind of skills were required. Whereas just because someone was an 1102 for 5 years doesn't mean they actually did anything pre-award related or whatever else. But even if you took all of that aside, people were getting certified when they had not even been 1102 for 5 years. So they were getting level 3 certified without even having been an 1102, or had prior related experience of any kind. And so, I just thought it was, I thought we were doomed when the solution of this high level working group was like, well, let's make it 6 years. So then it will be 5 years when they certify. I'm like, well, if they're going to certify it, if they're going to falsely certify, they'll falsely certify at any level. Making it 6 years is meaningless. So I just wanted to share those stories because I think they illustrate how, when you get a working group together to discuss, how to solve problems, um, they're not necessarily tackling the problem. The problem is that you have individual supervisors and higher level people who are signing off because they like the person, or they think the person, nobody wants to go back to that person and say, hey, you haven't been in 1102 for 5 years, or hey, your 5 years was only ordering. Let's try and get you some other experience. Nobody wants to have those discussions. And I didn't either as a boss. I hated calling people into my office and telling them that they were not at the skill level they thought they were. And, in their defense, they hated it too. It was not a fun discussion for any of us. But I at least made myself have those discussions. And I will say, not all of those people, but some of those people have come back to me and thanked me for that, because they took it, even though they were angry at me for several days thereafter, or sometimes weeks. They thought about it and decided that they would, be open to the idea that maybe they didn't know as much as they thought they did, and then started exposing themselves and reading books. And then, came back to me and said, you know what, I did not know as much as I thought I did, and I'm, learning and growing. And they did learn and grow. But those are tough discussions, and people are just not willing to have those discussions, I think,
Well,
anywhere in the workforce. And I think that's part of what's contributing to this.
Should do you think agencies should certify their own people, or should it be like a third
what does it
party?
matter? What does it matter anymore? I was going to say that. What does it all matter? You don't have to have those conversations anymore. The skill set required to be a DCMA contracting officer is the ability to pass what is the equivalent of an NCMA test. So, okay, you study 10 hours and you pass the test, and now you're in. Not even 10
I would
hours?
say not even,
Yeah, not
because
even.
the
So I guess it
CFCM is a
doesn't
lot
matter,
harder.
right? This is the decision. I would disagree with Jennifer about the root cause or the genesis or the origin of this whole thing. I think it goes back to the 90s and trying to deal with a shrinking defense budget under the Clinton years, the peace dividend. And at the time, the answer, which I still think is the right answer, is to give contracting officers more discretion, more flexible, to empower them to make decisions, because we can't afford to have a bureaucracy on top of them. Unfortunately, I would say it didn't come with any kind of consequences for not making good decisions, but moving on from that. So then as the 2000s rolled around and we had 9/11 and we had the global war on terror, all of a sudden defense spending flipped, and it grew amazingly in a short period of time. But DOD and DCMA in particular continued to shed personnel. The spending went up, the spending under contract and procurement went up, and they had fewer and fewer people to management. So rather than react at the time and get the headcount they needed, and by the way, retaining the skill sets they needed, they kept shrinking for years. And by 2010, it was almost like going down the sink, the drain. They had lost so much human capital knowledge that how were they going to recover? And in 2010, 2011, they could not reliably perform cost and price analysis. They just didn't have the skill set. So what do? We've decided it's not necessary. We don't need people to perform cost and price analysis. We don't need people to think independently. What you need to do is follow direction. If you have a question, talk to legal. Now, I just want to finish up by saying, what does talk to legal mean in my experience? I've only dealt with DCMA legal when they were across the table and we were negotiating the size of the settlement. So maybe my view is a little jaded. I have to honestly admit I'm probably biased. However, when I deal with attorneys of any stripe, what I noticed is that they tend to polarize. They want to protect their client's interests, they want to advocate for their client, and compromise is not really something that they do very well. So a contracting officer with discretion might decide to quote unquote split the baby to get the dispute resolved without actually going through the disputes process and ending up in the Court of Appeals and taking all those government resources. Lawyers, in my opinion, don't share that aversion to going to trial. Again, I'm biased, so correct me if you feel differently. So I predict that the more we get legal involved, the more we end up in court. Maybe I'll be wrong, but that's my prediction. That's what I wanted to say.
I've experienced legal on both sides of the spectrum, or both ends of the spectrum. And recently, I don't want to name names, but I'll just name a first name. Susan, who I worked with in the Army, was very good at suggesting solutions, where contracting officers were reticent to, they felt like it was their reputation and they didn't want to negotiate something, even when there was clearly a mistake in the contract and the government was, somewhat at fault, if not completely at fault. And so I've certainly seen attorneys who are very good at bringing that discretion and that spirit of compromise to the table, and certainly like, well, the only way this is going to get solved is if we compromise, because if we both just go to our corners and stick a flag in, it's not ever going to go anywhere. Having said that, I think that I think you're advocating for contracting officers that have discretion. So, while your blog article is like, well, maybe we're moving, maybe we, and by we, DoD leadership is moving into this area of like, hey, we don't need contracting officers that have discretion. But I think this goes back to, some of what Vern Edwards' original analysis was, some of these discussions that was going on right after 2000, like the early 2002, 3, 4, 5 area, where there has been a split. There's been a split in the workload, and there should have been some sort of associated split in the workforce. Unfortunately, we did not see that, and we still have this situation where the way a lot of DoD work got done was, we were way behind in computers. When I was very first hired, in the mid 90s, my boss was extremely proud that everyone in the office had a computer. And so, in the mid 90s, for a government office to have everyone with a computer, that was like a big, hooray. And so the government was behind in computers. But then we then we tried to catch up, and we started creating computer programs that did some of the work automatically for us. And we did realize efficiencies. There's no question about it. You can run a clause logic program and it will spit out clauses at you, whether they're accurate or not, who knows? And so that's kind of the situation we're in. But 95% of the time, 90% of the time, it doesn't really matter if they're accurate, because everybody does what they're supposed to do anyway. So that's part of how a lot of this work got done anyways. And then at the same time, there was this big push towards using more GSA schedules, having more large IDIQs, doing more competition at the order level. And so we did a lot of that kind of stuff. But now, again, like now, the unintended consequence is you have a very, very, very small group of people who have actually able to bring any kind of pre-award independent thought or rationale or skill set to the table in awarding those large IDIQs. And so they're awarding large IDIQs like they're competing orders, and they're not really paying attention to what's in the statement of work, or what's what's even happening, how the ordering process is even going to work. And so, I don't, instead of dealing with, I feel like they should have made a split in the workforce, and they should have said, okay, we're going to have a group of ordering officers and purchasing agents, and we're going to have a group, of of pre-award people, and we're going to focus on these pre-award people. And this is, I think, where it becomes this people problem is, you've got a workforce of, I don't even know what the size is now, 60 to 90,000 1102s,
Wow.
and all of those, how many is it?
No, I thought it was less than that.
It probably is. It's probably now 40,000 or, whatever. But if you add in the 1105s and property people, but all 100% of those people are going to say, well, I belong in that small pre-award group. And nobody wants to tell the 95 to 97% of those people that, no, you don't actually, your workload is not that. So that's where I feel like it's ultimately a people problem, because nobody wants to deal with the people.
Um, let's think of it like, let's say that all contracting officers had the type of discretion that Nick advocates for. Would that be good? I mean, wouldn't it be difficult for industry to accept that these are two different contracting officers from the same agency, and
Yeah.
they're arriving at different decisions? Like, I think there's an expectation of
Somebody wiser than me once
consistency when
said
you're dealing with the
consistency is
government.
the hobgoblin of little minds. And what that means today is that consistency is a goal only in the centralized bureaucracy, the fourth estate. Contractors don't really go about it. We don't really care about consistency. We care about a fair outcome in the individual circumstances. And we care about a contracting officer who will make a God blessed decision rather than running it up the flagpole to a review board and then going down and getting a peer review and then going to the boss over there and getting a different review. And by the time you get the answer, it's been reviewed by so many people, it no longer bears anything resembling what the parties thought they'd agreed to. So that might be slightly hyperbole. But what I'm saying is, we don't think of contractors don't worry about consistency. They worry about fairness and equity given the circumstances. And they love a contracting officer who will make a decision. Even if it's adverse to their interests, at least they can then appeal it, But letting stuff linger and fester and go along for months, if not sometimes years, that's in no one's best interest. And I guarantee the contractors would rather have it resolved quickly than and worry about, well, this contracting officer would have decided it differently. My take, anyway.
But what about complaints about commercial item determinations? That's kind of what resulted in the DCMA commercial item group, was because you had different contracting officers looking at the same product of a company, one
I
saying
would
it's
like to
commercial,
restate what
the
you
other
said.
saying it's not.
You had contract officers who were afraid to decide an item was commercial because they were afraid they were going to be criticized by somebody in legal. So creating the commercial item group gave coverage to these contracting officers who otherwise wouldn't have made a decision, or who would have decided against commercial item simply as the risk-averse decision. That's how I see it. I experienced it, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
I see. I I see it very differently, because I think the commercial item group was actually created to make decisions about commercial services, um, rather than items. They weren't necessarily products, because products are very straightforward, but services are substantially less straightforward. And buying services commercially it can be very risky, when there really isn't a fixed price, because commercial you can only go fixed price. And so my sense is contracting officers would say, oh, well, this is a commercial service. For I'll use, for example, these huge base operating support contracts at many Army bases or Navy bases or whatever. And while you can certainly make a compelling argument that a locksmith is a commercial service, or a door handle replacement is a commercial service, I don't think you can make a compelling argument that servicing a 500-mile wide square wide area of some unknown large number of buildings, 100% for every kind of thing that goes wrong has a commercial equivalent. It doesn't. There is no commercial equivalent. Maybe the closest equivalent would be universities or school districts, but oddly enough, they don't sell those out commercially. They just have a group of handymen who take care of it because it's substantially cheaper than having someone get charged. Because basically, oh, call the base support contractor for a lockout of a room at like 5 a.m. in the morning, and you get charged like these obscene amounts of money, but you never know what it's going to be in advance, and so you end up with these like cost reimbursement contracts masquerading as fixed price contracts, because it's a commercial service. And so I think the commercial, I think the commercial item group was, I think there's a lot more nuance there than anyone even still realizes to this day. So I would take a step back on that one. But that's where I go back to, someone has to have that individual discretion and thought process instead of just making these snap determinations. Oh, well, a locksmith is commercial, a plumber is commercial. Yeah, but do you know when the plumber comes what you're going to pay? To this day, no one knows what you're going to pay the plumber when they show up
But
at the door,
Jennifer,
because
you're
they all work
describing
time
what
and
I
materials.
experience every time I call the plumber to my personal house. I never know what I'm going to pay, and it's going to be exorbitant anyway. So it is literally a commercial situation, but I don't want to argue with you about that. I know Ryan O'Connell at the Boston CIG. I've worked with him. I've spoken on panels with him. I love him. He's great. I think the CIG is great. In my opinion, the CIG was created to make the decisions that the average contracting officer was not equipped. You go back to the skills and the training. Either they weren't equipped to make the decision, or they were afraid to make the decision, and therefore they dithered to no one's best interest. I'm still going to come back. I experienced that with a contractor, where it was clearly a commercial item that had been developed at private expense and was sold in substantial quantities in the marketplace. And there were many competing vendors who sold the same product, and the contracting officer just wouldn't go for it. No reason, no rationale, just wouldn't. And it came down to risk aversion, in my personal opinion. Anyway, I don't know how we got to commercial item. It's a great topic. It's probably a different podcast topic, though.
Yeah.
Well, I think it goes back to that discretion, though.
Yeah.
Because the underlying problem is, who has the discretion to make that decision? Is it each individual contracting officer?
You can't give them discretion unless they can handle discretion. And if they're not trained and they're not experienced, there's no sense giving them discretion even to start with. We would all agree with that, right? So where we are today, in my view, is a recognition that contracting officers can't handle discretion if it were to be given to them. So therefore, it's been taken away and replaced with prescriptive instructions. Go talk to legal if you have any questions. And, it's a controversial point, but I like saying it.
Or with a centralized working group.
So I don't see this problem getting corrected, right? By teaching contracting officers that are, resistant to, critical thinking, using their discretion, things like that, training them to think critically and all that stuff. I think what's going to happen in the future is we're going to automate more and more of what's contracting. There's no reason that computers can't follow these prescriptive instructions from DCMA, right? So I think that, 20 or 30 years from now, a lot of the tasks that are being prescribed are going to be automated. And I don't know, I don't think you're going to need a lot of 1102s. I think you're going to need somebody to, you know,
Well, we can
keep the
take the
robots running.
commercial item
That's
group and
about it.
extend that logic
You
and
know,
say, let's create a DoD pre-award center of excellence in different parts of the country, staffed by a select cadre of highly trained critical thinkers and innovative doers, maybe as many as 100 for the entire Department of Defense. And they'll make all the pre-award um, source selections and source evaluations and selections. Somebody else will put the solicitation together. Somebody else will do the award factors. And this small elite cadre will take care of all that hard stuff. And everyone else will just be an ordering officer, or to your point, Don, a machine, an AI. Um, wow, let's see how we'll get consistency, but at what price, huh?
I heard a funny story about the factory of the future. And the factory of the future has two living beings, right? A human and a dog, okay? The dog's job is to keep the human away from the machinery, and the human's job is to feed the dog.
That's a bleak future. That's a bleak future. You may not be wrong though, but it's bleak. Um, I don't know.
So,
I think this topic is just really worthy of discussion. But unfortunately, the people who need to be having this discussion aren't the three of us. There are probably some senior executive service people sitting somewhere
yeah,
within, target radius of the Pentagon who really should be concerned about the future of DoD acquisition, because if it really is coming down to follow the rules, check with legal, get your peer reviews in, then your notion about innovation in acquisition and your notion of streamlining to avoid the situation that Vern Edwards documented about taking longer to choose a handgun for the Army than it took to fight World War II. I mean, that's going to be the new norm because you got to go through chop, 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 step by step, follow the prescriptive guidance. God forbid you should do something outside the workflow that's been outlined for you. And at that point, we might as well all be computers.
Well, they certainly recognize there's a problem, which is why they're trying to, come up with a solution. Now, whether this is the solution remains to be seen. I mean, it might be in the sense that, instead of relying on DAU to do all of the training, this is going to push more of that, the 80 continuous hours would move more towards, discretionary training. So,
good for
so who,
us.
who knows? Yeah, in theory, assuming our training is good, which I like to think it is. And so maybe it will help, but it's hard telling. I mean, it just seems like it's sending a little bit of a wrong message of like, hey, we don't need a degree anymore. We don't need this, but they are saying you definitely still need a degree to be an 1102. I mean, that's statutory. You still need a degree to be a contracting officer. You just don't need a degree to be certified. And there's only going to be one level of certification, and you're only going to need to pass a test to get it, I guess.
I didn't know that. You didn't need a degree to be
Yeah.
certified now?
But the thing
Yeah,
is, didn't
that's what the
Jennifer,
memo
didn't you
says.
get the
Oh,
distinct impression from
I
reading
missed.
the B2B AWF 21st century memo that they wish the statute didn't require a bachelor's degree for 1102? It's almost like that was like, oh man, we wish we could take this away also, but unfortunately, until the statute changes, we're stuck. Right? I got a sense of reluctance at it.
That, yeah, I got that same impression. but I think they're living in this fantasy world where everybody's like a Steve Jobs. That's it's not really the case. A degree, it may not mean much, but it does mean
Is
something
everybody a Steve
Yeah.
Jobs or is everybody a
most
Homer
of the time.
Simpson?
All right. Well,
You can get that on a t-shirt, I'm sure.
all right. All right. So we're coming up on an
I
hour. Any
started it, so
closing
I'll start the
statements?
closing. I think this ought to concern everybody who thinks that government contracting and acquisition is a profession and should be pursued as a profession. Um, and and it may just be too late at this point. But I think we all ought to be concerned because there's a lot of people out there. I know they're on WIFCON and I know they're lurking and reading and trying to get this right, who believe that this is a subject worth studying and getting right and thinking critically about. I don't know if it's too late for those people.
Jennifer.
I'm going to be an optimist and say it's not too late for those people. But I think I'm going to say what I said even 15, 16 years ago when Don and I were first discussing these topics in front of people in DAU courses in the professional development section, which is you're going to have to rely on yourself. You're going to have to buy the books and read them. You're going to have to get on WIFCON. You're going to have to, do the majority of professional development yourself. And if you do that, you'll be just fine. Because there are resources out there. You just are going to have to find them and dig them out yourself. And so I think there is hope for those people. So I'll leave that as my closing statement for those people of you who are watching this podcast. There's hope. Just you got to do it yourself.
That's a great point. Um, I don't think of all my contracting knowledge that I have, I don't can't attribute a lot of it to my DAU classes. I can't really remember a lot of stuff that I learned in DAU classes that I didn't later unlearn um, or forget. So yeah, I mean, I think the training getting cut to 200 hours is great. It's a good start. I'd like to see it go to zero. I don't think there should be any required training that every 1102 must take. I do think there are professional standards that everyone should meet, and maybe DAU's role should be to make sure people meet those standards. Um, but how people get there should be up to them, how they achieve those standards. I learned the best, I probably just through discussions and independent research. And at first I'm on WIFCON asking the questions, and now I've kind of gravitated to answering the questions. Um, to me, that there's nothing better than that. So, all right, so that's our podcast. We'll see you in 2 weeks with a new interesting topic that I have 2 weeks to come up with.
Oh my God.
And until
How about
then,
commercial item?
yeah, that's a good one.